Now let's look at some cleanup actions that can be done. So if we look at the block on code on the left hand side, we have a new block here which is finally. So if we have a try block that has a print statement in this case which doesn't generate any error, then that particular block would run, and after that the finally block would run, which is goodbye world. So no error in the try block, goodbye world. However, if the try block raises an error, such as here on the right hand side we are raising the keyboard interrupt error, and that error is not handled by an except block, and so what's going to happen is the control would go to the finally block, which will print the goodbye world, and after that the traceback for the error would be printed, which is the keyboard interrupt. So this would run, but that is not going to generate any output because the controls would go to the finally block. After this block is run, then the error or the traceback for the keyboard interrupt would be put in the output, and that's what we see here. So the finally clause is run after the try block. That's something important to remember. Now let's move forward, and let me check where we are at. So that, go back to the cursor mode, and in the second case now, what we have is a set of finally with except. So if we have a try on the left hand side, if we have a try except finally set of blocks, if the try block raises an exception, here it's a keyboard interrupt. This is handled by the except clause which we have right after that, and so what would happen is the except block would get run, and user press the key to stop the run. That we see in the output, and after that the controls go to the finally block, and it says goodbye world. So the finally block would run in the very end. However, if the try block does raise an error, such as we see here, which is a keyboard interrupt error, then here's what would happen. Before the before the keyboard interrupt error gets handled in a way, the finally block would run first, and after that we'll see the traceback for the keyboard interrupt. So in here, down here, we see that goodbye world is printed first, and then the traceback for the keyboard interrupt follows. So points to note is, if the error is handled, it is a priority and it's done before finally. If it's not handled, then finally block runs first, and the error is kind of traceback for the error follows after that. In another situation, what we have is an exception. So we have the try block, which raises the keyboard interrupt error. Then we have the except block that raises yet another error, and after that we have the finally block. So in situations such as this one, here's how the flow is. First, the try block error is raised. That will in this case the keyboard interrupt, that exception matches the one that's written here in the except statement. So we'll enter the except block, and this would print the user pressed key to stop the run, and immediately after that the finally block would run instead of the second error, and we see the goodbye world following the finally block. Then the second raised name error would be tackled, and that's where we see this name error printed out. So we have the user pressed the key to stop the run, that's first. Then we have the finally block, and then we have the traceback for the keyboard interrupt, very first one, and the name error as the last one. That's what is written here in the docs. An exception could occur during the execution of an except or else clause. again the exception is re-raised after the finally clause has been executed. So finally clause gets the priority. Again, if the finally clause gets clause executes a break, such as here we have the while loop where we have the try except finally blocks. The try block raises an error that goes to the except block, and so the error is handled. But then the finally block has a break, and what that does is it breaks that particular sequence, and so the name error is not raised in that case. Okay, so the exceptions after that are not raised. And this is another situation where we have the break inside of the try block rather than the finally block. In this case, then the keyboard interrupt error is raised, and so the control goes to the except block. We see the print statement getting executed. User pressed key to stop the run, and that's what we see. After that, the finally block is run as we would expect, and that's what we see. And then after that, the second error is raised, which is the name error, and that's what's here in the docs, which is the try statement has, if it reaches a break, then the finally clause will execute just prior to the break statement's execution run. And this is the list of the topics that we just looked at, each of these with an example. Next, here is another example of the finally block, which is to tell that finally clause is executed in any event. So here we have the try block and the finally block. So if we call this function boolean return, the try block gets run first, but after that the finally block is run, and so what we see in the output is the output that is returned by the finally clause and not the try clause. So we see that false, and this after that the remaining code is run, and the remainder of the code has the false here, so we see that second false printed in the output. Again, here is another situation where we have, this is an interesting example where we have a function divide that divides x by y with x and y are two input arguments, and that line of code is inside of the try block. We have then an except clause following the try block, and then we have else clause following the except, and finally clause following the else. So the very first case, we pass in the values 2 and 1 to the divide. So x is equal to 2, y is equal to 1. So we divide 2 by 1, the result is 2. There's no error, everything is good. So the except block is skipped. We go to the else block. The print result is 2. That's what we see here. And after that, the control goes to finally block, and this will print executing finally clause, and this is printed. So everything works well as we would expect. There's no problem here. However, now in this case, we are passing value of y as 0. So this is going to, the x divided by y is going to throw an error which is zero division error, and so a exception would be raised, and the except block here, this name of exception matches the exception that was raised in the try block, and so we enter the except block where the print division by 0 is printed, and that's what we see here in the output. That's the first one. Following that, we enter the else statement, and looks like we do not enter the else statement. Sorry about that. We directly move on to enter the finally block, and here we see this getting printed. So in any case, even though the else block gets skipped if an exception is raised, the finally block is always executed. That's the takeaway from this slide. Here we are skipping the else, but we are not skipping the finally. And here we have another example where we have the same divide x by x y, same function, nothing has changed except what the value of y that we are going to pass in and the value of x. Here 2 and 1 are strings because we have put quotations around both of them, and when this goes in here we see that the x string 2 divided by string 1 is definitely going to throw an error, and it's a type error which is not what we have in the except. In except we have the zero division error, so this error is not going to match with this, and so we cannot enter the except, and so that's what we call that the error is not handled. We are not handling the error because the except does not have that error mentioned there, and so the controls then go to the finally. Again the else block is skipped and the control go to finally, and finally would get executed, so we see executing finally clause, and after that we see the traceback for the type error as shown below. So several situations we looked at. In this situation, uh, uh, the very first case we saw that there was no error. If there is no error, the else block gets executed and finally block gets executed. If there is a error but it is handled by an except clause, then the else is skipped but finally is executed. If the error is not handled by the except block, then both the except and held, both of them are skipped, but the finally it gets still executed. So that's what we have for the finally block. Now moving on, here's a note that if you are trying to open a file such as shown here in the top code for line in open file my file.txt and do something with the information in that file, the problem with this code is that it leaves the file open, and so as a best practice, this is what mentioned in docs, is that we want to use with open myfile.txt as f and then use that f inside of the for loop. So what this does is after we are done with the for loop, it will automatically close the file. So that was just a note I thought would be helpful here to mention.